how do you actually, from a financial management perspective, so this is now purely about the numbers and the bean counting, how do you correlate different funding statements, different staffing structures with creating a budget? Do you still budget school by school? Do you budget kind of functionally? How does that look?
So I think I guess to come back on that, I don't think it does start with the accounting and the bean counting. I think it starts back from that to say, are we clear now on what we want every school to be delivering? So have we got that consistent view of what our offer should look like? So then our budgeting process is just a very open discussion as a starting point around what does each of our schools need to deliver on that offer. So we start off with what do we believe in as a trust, and our head teachers are part of those discussions. Every one of our students should benefit from. And then it's that conversation at school level to say, where are we at against that now? And what else do we need resourcing wise to make that happen? So we kind of cost from a bottom up point of view. We work out what the staffing model looks like, needs to look like in each school to deliver on that mission. We look at the resourcing requirements. Similarly, we look at from the central point of view, what does the central structure need to look like to make sure we're delivering maximum value, and kind of budget bottom up so that we still look at each school as an individual kind of cost centre, I suppose, if you look at it in that terms. They still have their own staffing budget, they still have their own kind of functional curriculum budgets, estates budgets, etc. And some of those are line managed centrally. So for example, our estates function is centralised, but curriculum budgets would still always be delegated at individual school level, and individual schools would have the opportunity to flex the way that they're deployed between different areas. And essentially we budget on that basis. So we kind of stand back at some point and say, right, we've now looked at what each of our schools are telling us they need. How does that sit within the kind of the cumulative trust budget? And essentially funding is just deployed in order to meet the needs that we've agreed that schools have. So then there's always that kind of the comparison come March when we stand back and say, does what the school needs add up to what our total funding statements tell me we have? And if it doesn't, then we have to start going back and re-looking at that. But generally, looking at it in those terms, it means that we really focus on the things that really make a difference in each of our schools. So rather than thinking about some of the perhaps cosmetic things that we do or things that don't actually make a direct impact on pupils, we focus very much with the schools on what are the things that are going to make the difference to the students in your schools right now. How do we resource that? And then let's look as a trust to say, does our cumulative funding as a group allow us to do that, rather than having that situation where we've got barriers between individual schools where some schools can do it but some schools can't?
Do you use kind of ICFP metrics or any method of saying, well, actually, this is kind of basic need, this puts a teacher in every class in terms of, we know this will cover the basics, and then you look at it of well, let's fund the basics first, and then we're dealing with the bonuses on top? Is that how do you break down thinking in that way, or is it not quite as distinct as that?
So I think this is where the accountant in me will start crying, but I don't really believe in management by metrics or management by kind of KPIs and ratios. So I think ICFP is a really, really useful tool to signpost and to flag up potential kind of issues, but we don't manage on that basis. So we tend to use ICFP as a checker rather than as a director. So we look at our staffing models based on what we think we need, what our schools think they need. We develop them in that way. And then we use ICFP to say, how reasonable is that compared to what we'd expect through industry norms and through trust averages? Having said that, we will still get to a point where in some of our smaller schools, we know our average class sizes or our pupil teacher ratios are not going to meet those thresholds. And that's okay, because that's our strategic choice, that we're kind of overfunding those schools to make sure they can still offer that broader curriculum delivery that those children deserve. So it's ICFP is never used to drive a yes or a no answer. It's never used to tell us what we can and can't do. It's a checker at the end to say, do we understand why these ratios are what they are? And are we happy with that strategic choice? And also we can use them then to cost and say, we know it's costing us more to offer that broader curriculum in that smaller school, but do we know how much it's costing us? And are we still happy that that's a worthwhile investment? And so it just gives us the transparency and the clarity over the decisions we're making, but it doesn't make the decision for us. And I think that's really important.
No, definitely. And I think that ability to say, well, look, there's some guidance out there in terms of acceptable ratios, or well, actually not even acceptable. There's some guidance out there in terms of, actually the guidance is quite strong in terms of expected ratios and target ratios. But I think what you say is really important, that those ratios don't mean a lot as long as you're deliberate in your relationship to that ratio. And that could be we're deliberately higher or deliberately lower, but you're there because you're doing that for a particular reason rather than being accidentally higher or lower. And I think that's where some people are on a journey where, well, look, first of all, I need to know where we are against those ratios, and then we're hoping we're there for a reason. But that mastery piece is, well, look, we're using them as a guidance, as a check, and I love that, use it as a checker rather than a director. I think is really powerful, because it does help you sense check whether, because if you are high or low on a particular, does that correlate with our thought processes on why? And if it doesn't, then it's something to look at and think, okay, well, that is something we can do, or our thought process was wrong. But yeah, you're not aiming for them for the sake of aiming for them.
No, and I think it's really hard to rag rate a contact ratio, for example.
Yeah.
So do we want a contact ratio that's as high as possible because it's financially efficient, or do we want it as low as possible to promote staff well-being, to give staff more opportunities for CPD and to develop their practice? Well, the answer is neither and both. We kind of want to achieve both of those things.
Yeah.
And the sweet spot in each school, in each trust, will be different depending on the resources available. So if it's about looking at it in the context of what it is you're trying to achieve. The average class size, for example, in our smaller school is not the same average class size I'd want to see in our larger schools, because I would expect them to be more efficient. That's just part of the context of those schools, where they are at this point in time and where they are in their development journey. So I think it's very hard to sit there and say that's what we should be expecting in all of our schools, because actually what we expect from our schools at any one time at this moment is different.
And I think that's important, because I think quite often accountants get a bad rap, and sometimes that's justified, but it is not always. Yeah, not always. But that kind of stubbornness to be, will need to be at these metrics, and for example, average teacher costs or contact ratios, let's get them as low as we possibly can. But then what happens to supply? All of these metrics are linked, and you can't put any focus on any individual metric, because if you tighten one down over here, something else is going to spring up. But it's just having the awareness and understanding to be bold enough to say, these are a guiding principle, or help us assess where we are, but they're not in any way going to direct us to do something that is against culture, values, or anything else.
100%. I mean, fundamentally, we are education organisations, aren't we? We're here to educate pupils, and that's our primary focus. So I'm a real believer then, whether it's a finance function, an HR function, a states function, they're facilitators of that goal, which is to educate young people. And so as a trust, what we've really focused on is empowering our head teachers and our school leaders to say, we're here to back you to achieve what you want for your schools. And our finance function shouldn't be the barrier to doing that. It should be the facilitator. Now, at the same time, the function's there to make sure that we remain compliant with our regulatory expectations, that we remain sustainable in the future, and they're there to guide our schools to make sure we stay within those principles. But more and more, it's about finding the solutions to what our schools need, as opposed to explaining the reasons why it can't be done.